It is absolutely my pleasure to welcome Dr. Saundra Yancy McGuire to give our keynote speech for this year. Dr. Saundra Yancy McGuire is the Director Emerita of the Center for Academic Success and a retired Assistant Vice Chancellor and Professor of Chemistry at Louisiana State University. She's delivered keynote addresses or presented workshops on effective learning strategies at over 500 institutions in 47 states and 14 countries. We are so fortunate to have her here today. Prior to joining LSU, she has spent 11 years at Cornell University, where she received the coveted Clark Distinguished Teaching Award. Her best-selling books, Teach Students How to Learn and Teach Yourself How to Learn, are widely acclaimed by faculty and students and definitely worth reading. The parent version, The Parent's Guide to Studying and Learning, was released in January of 2022. Dr. McGuire's most recent accolades include being named a 2022 Louisiana Legend by Louisiana Public Broadcasting, being listed in the 2020 edition of Marquis' Who's Who in America, receiving the 2019 Commitment to Excellence in Academic Support Award from the Commission for Academic Support in Higher Education, and induction in 2017 into the LSU College of Science Hall of Distinction. She's an elected fellow of the American Chemical Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Council of Learning Assistance and Developmental Education Associations. She received the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring in a White House Oval Office ceremony. Dr. McGuire received her bachelor's degree magna cum laude from Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, her master's degree from Cornell University, and her doctoral degree from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, where she received the Chancellor Citation for Exceptional Professional Promise. She is married to Dr. Stephen C. McGuire, the James and Ruth Smith Professor of Physics Emeritus at Southern University. They're the parents of Dr. Carla McGuire Davis and Dr. Stephanie McGuire, and the doting grandparents of Joshua, Ruth, Daniel, and Joseph. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Saundra McGuire as our keynote. Saundra, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. And thank you for allowing me to be here. I'm so excited about this. And I want to say that I'm really not coming as the expert who's going to tell you that you need to change your teaching or what to do. The expertise is here in the room. And so I'm just going to share some ideas that I have come to recognize as being effective over the years that I've been doing this. But I know that those of you who have been in this space a long time, you've got even more ideas than I have. So this is going to be a sharing session. And I'm going to ask you to do something that I wish I had done at the beginning of my career. And I didn't do that. Everybody who's in this session right now has had students who were not doing well in your class, and they came and talked to you, and then they started doing a lot better. I had students who are like that. But if you're like me, you never ask those students to send me an email and tell me exactly what you changed. And I've been doing that. I started doing it about probably 15 years before I retired. And that information is really, really helpful, because it will add to your repertoire strategies that you can share with other students, and also keep the before and after scores. So for example, if a student had made a 60 on the first test, they came and talked to you, and then they made 80, 85 on the next test. And now you have the strategies that they used. And so if a student comes in and says, woe is me, I made a 70 on the first test, I'm doomed. And then you can say, oh, don't worry about that. I'm going to share with you some of the strategies that other students have used who were even in worse condition, worse shape than you were on the first test, and they ended up with an A in the course. And so I think that I have found that that's really, really helpful, because most times when students come to our office, I found they haven't done well, they don't really think we're going to tell them anything useful. They think that we're going to tell them, you need to study harder, or just tell them stuff they know, but not things that are going to be useful. And so that's very helpful. The other thing I wanted everybody to know is you are going to get the full set of these PowerPoint slides after the keynote, and you're going to get them in PowerPoint form, not in PDF form, so that you can pick and choose any of the slides that you want to share with your students. Okay, so let's get going. So I'm going to be talking about closing what I call the metacognitive equity gap by teaching students how to learn. And first, I want to give a sincere thank you to our colleagues at the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning for inviting me to do this. And this is a wonderful symposium, and congratulations on having this going for 8 years, even during the pandemic. And I could see in the remarks that the provost made and that Sarah made, you're really invested in teaching and improving teaching and making the best possible experience for the students. And so I really appreciate, I think somebody's probably got a mute. I'm hearing some background. I don't know if anybody else is hearing that. Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. I think it stopped now. Yes. And so what I was saying is, I love it when I'm at institutions where there's a real focus on teaching. And I love that. But what I'm going to be talking about today is how we can get students to understand what their role in the learning process is. Because over the years, I had been to lots of great teaching conferences, professional development activities, symposia, and they had wonderful sessions. Oh, and I looked through the sessions for today's conference, and you are really in for a treat. I wish I could attend a lot of those, but they're being recorded, so I'm going to look at some of them later. But when I went to those, it always seemed to me that we were missing 50% of the equation, because we could be the best faculty in the universe. We could have the most effective strategies of any faculty anywhere. But if students aren't coming to the table understanding what their role in the process is and how to actively play that role, we're not going to see the kind of learning gains we could see if they were active participants in the process. So what I'm going to be talking about is how we can get students to understand their role and accept that role. And whenever I speak at institutions, I always like to look to see what the retention and graduation rates are. And my source is College Factual here. And this is for UWM. And you have a very good first to second year retention rate, 73%. It's over the national average, and it's over the Wisconsin average. Wisconsin is about the same as the national average. But when I looked at the graduation rates, that's a little bit of an area, that we can do a little bit of work in. Overall, it's 45.1%. The national average is 54.7%. And so a little bit below the average. Now, this site also gives me the expected graduation rate for students who come with the preparation level that students come to the institutions with. And so your expected rate is only about 52%. So there's not a huge gap, but there is a gap. And I think what happens so often when we see that the first year retention rate is pretty good, so often students in that first year of classes, they are seeing content that many of them have seen in high school. For example, the first year of college chemistry, those concepts typically are covered in a very good high school chemistry class. And so they're not seeing a lot of new stuff, but then when they hit sophomore, junior year, then they're seeing lots of new stuff. And if they don't have effective learning strategies, then that's where they're going to flounder. And so I think that UWM can improve the retention and graduation rates by teaching students how to learn, helping them actively engage in learning, and then motivating them to implement the effective strategies that we're going to be talking about. And so as an agenda for our brief time together this morning, I'm going to define metacognition and talk about metacognitive equity, and we'll see some examples demonstrating impact. And then I will talk about some of the effective strategies that are not difficult for us to implement. And then we'll talk about Bloom's taxonomy, the study cycle, and then have a conclusion and wrap up. And I do have some poll questions. We're going to use the chat box a lot, and I have some polls, and I want to thank Lane for putting the polls together for me. And so the first thing that I like to know from audiences is how familiar you are with the work. Oh, and I see some people are putting it in the chat box. Lane is going to pop up the poll where you can actually vote in just a minute, I think. Is that true, Lane?
Yes, I'm just waiting for you to introduce it.
Oh, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. As soon as I pop up the slide and poll, you can put it up there. Yes. And so our colleagues who put the answers in the chat box, if you could also vote, that would be great. Yeah, and I asked this question because if pretty much everybody there has either attended a presentation or read one of the books, then I know you know all this stuff, and I can just say, well, thank you for coming and have a great week. But I see that that's not the case here. And typically, we're already up to 72%. Usually when we get to about 70%, then I give you the 5-second warning. And so I'm going to give you 5 more seconds to weigh in, and then I'll end the poll and share the results. Okay, and so we are pretty much there. And so what you'll see is that most people, none of the above. Okay, great. And so then the next poll question is, I like to know how familiar you are with metacognition. And so if you could just answer this. Oh, that was lickety split, Lane. Thank you. Yeah, if you know a lot, almost nothing, quite a bit, or more than you care to know. And I see I already have one more than I care to know. One time I was doing a presentation and the person who did that said, oh, that was a mistake. But then sometimes it's not a mistake. And if it is not, I totally understand that. And I will explain. Oh, wow, we're at 83%. So the 5-second warning. And I will end the poll and share the results. And you will see, okay, so most of us, just about 86%, almost nothing or a little bit, and 13% quite a lot, and 1 more than I care to know. Okay, and Adiola says, okay, metacognition is my background. I'm a neuropsychologist by training. Okay, fantastic. And were you the person who said more than I care to know? Probably not. Oh, you were? Okay. I was thinking you might not be because that's your background. And actually what I thought it was, because sometimes in the past, it's been people who have been introduced to metacognition, but in a way that is, I guess, pretty complicated, let's say, because there are different aspects, there are different types of metacognition, and you can kind of get in the weeds, and Adiola would probably agree with this, but metacognition can be presented in a way where it looks like it's a pretty complicated concept. And I don't do that. And so, because when I talk to students about a concept that I really want them to do something with, then I want to make it as simple as possible so that they understand it at an intuitive level. And so the definition of metacognition I like, and metacognition is just a term that was coined by cognitive psychologist Flavel back in 1976. And simply put, and my apologies to you, Adiola, because I use the very simplest definition, but it's your ability to think about your own thinking. So when I explain it to students, I say, it's as if you have a big brain outside your brain, looking at what your brain is doing. And that big brain is asking your brain questions. And it's saying, does she really understand this information, or did she just memorize it last night because the test is today? Okay. So yeah, very approachable. Exactly. Yeah. And so what I want them to understand is that they have the ability to analyze what their brain is doing. So the metacognitive brain is looking at what your brain is doing and saying, are you memorizing? Are you really understanding? It's saying, if you have a paper to write, do you realize that you need to start early? You need to, as soon as you get the topic, you need to decide how you're going to organize the paper. If there's a writing center, you need to go there and get some information from the writing center. You need to develop a draft quickly enough so that you can let the instructor see it, get feedback, and you can make modifications. So when you turn in the final paper, it's in the best possible shape. Or are you planning to just whip it out the night before the way you did in high school? So it's your ability to know that you can control your own thinking. You can analyze it and control it. It's your ability to be consciously aware that you are a problem solver. So when things come up that you don't know the answer to, you don't have to get somebody else to answer all your questions. You can take the steps to figure out some things. And I think it takes students out of what I call kind of victim mentality, where I find so many students, well, I didn't know there was going to be a test today. You didn't tell me that this was going to happen. And if they are using their metacognitive brain, then they can answer a lot of things for themselves. And I'll give you an example for that. And here's a question for the chat box. If we really think about it, most of the questions that our students ask us about our courses, where could they find that information? It's like, when is the next test going to be? How many papers do I have to write? Where could they find that? Exactly. Yes, on the syllabus. Yes. In Canvas, yeah. And so if a student is not using the metacognitive brain, then they say, oh, I wonder when the next test is going to be. Let me go ask the instructor. And the metacognitive brain says, you don't have to ask the instructor about that. We don't have to do that. We can answer that question. And so then the brain says, well, I don't know when the next test is supposed to be. How am I going to find, I'm supposed to answer that question. And the metacognitive brain says, well, what resources did our instructor give us that might have that information on it? And so it leads the student to the syllabus or to the Canvas site, and they get the information. And I tell students that, this doesn't mean that you're not going to talk to your instructors, because you will, because there will be questions that you can't answer that you'll need to talk with your instructors about. But when you use this process, you will have answered the questions you can answer for yourself. So you'll be able to have a more productive discussion with the instructor, because you won't have to spend time asking questions that you could have gotten the answers to before you had the meeting. It's your ability to plan, monitor, evaluate, and control your mental processing, so you know if you're understanding something or just memorizing it. It's your ability to accurately judge your level of learning. And that is huge, because, and here's a question for the chat box. How many of you have ever had a student, you give them a test back, they haven't done well, but then they say, but I studied for hours and hours for that test. I don't know why I didn't do well. Give me a yes or no in the chat box if you've ever had that experience. Okay, all the time, John says yes. Yeah, and when they say that they've studied for hours and hours, those students typically are not lying. They have studied for hours and hours. But my question for you in the chat box is, what kind of activities were they engaged in when they were studying for hours and hours for the upcoming test? What kinds of things? Okay, yes, they were memorizing, passively reading, rereading their notes. Absolutely. And I'll take a couple of more. Okay, multitasking. Okay, in fact, Christopher, that was the kind of answer I was looking for. And Erica says highlighting. Yeah, usually when I ask that question, there are some Dana not processing the information. Faculty will say, well, they were on TikTok, they were on their phone. And you're right, some of them are, but I'm not even talking about those. I'm talking about the students who really thought that they were studying. Yeah, looking at note cards. Okay, some of them while watching Netflix, some of them not. But basically what's happening is, they're cramming, is they are studying, but at too low a level. Now, many of them have memorized the information very well. And so let's say if it were a psychology course and the question were, define positive reinforcement, define negative reinforcement, define punishment. They're good to go because they've memorized those definitions. But those aren't the kind of questions we ask. We want them to apply the information. And so we will ask questions like, we'll give them a scenario and ask, in this particular scenario, will positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or punishment be most effective, and defend your choice? Well, they're not ready for that. Now, when I talk with students, I will often ask them, how many of you have ever heard a professor say something like, this is the university. You've got to kick it up a notch. This is not high school anymore. All the hands go up. But then when I ask, what do you think those professors are talking about when they say you got to kick it up a notch? You got to go to a higher level. This is not high school anymore. And very few hands go up. But the ones that do, they'll say things like, they mean that it's going to be harder here at UWM than it was in high school. Sometimes they say they're going to give us a lot more work. Sometimes they'll say we have to take more responsibility for our own learning. And I say, yep, all of those are correct. But then I ask, how many of you have ever heard of Bloom's taxonomy? And almost nobody has. And so let me ask those of us in the room, give me a yes or no. Would you say that you are very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy? or not so much. And it's okay if, the answer is no. Okay, and I'm not surprised that, okay, so I said, yes, very familiar. Okay, I'm seeing a couple of no's. And so we'll talk about it. And I think probably some of us are all bloomed out by now. But some of us are not. And so we're going to talk about how I discuss it with students. Now, just for our colleagues who said that they are very familiar with it, put in the chat box, yes or no. Have you actively taught Bloom's taxonomy to your students? Taken actually some time in class to teach Bloom's taxonomy to your students? Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so I'm seeing lots of yeses. And I'm seeing some no's, okay? And so I'm gonna urge all of us to actively teach Bloom's to students. Now I understand those of us who are not, because I never taught Bloom's to students before I got to LSU. And I knew Bloom's taxonomy. I learned it in graduate school because my PhD is in chemical education. But I learned it as a construct that we would use to structure our teaching, to target our assessment, etc. But I never taught it to students. But when I started teaching it to students, the reaction that I got, I was surprised by it. The number one reaction I got, students would say, wow, I wish somebody had told me about this before. I wish I had known about this in high school. And so, but intro work was so structured. Yes, and this is what we, I think, do a lot. We as faculty, we structure our courses based on Bloom's taxonomy. But I think that introducing students to Bloom's provides them the lens through which they can interpret our statements that you've got to kick it up a notch. And I've had so many students who were stuck in just, memorizing mode. But then when they saw that, there's analyzing, there's creating, then it opens up a whole new way of looking at what's happening to them. And so I'm going to encourage all of us to do that. And it's great that, we're using the concept, but if we let students in on the secret, then we'll find that they will be in a position to do more in terms of moving up Bloom's taxonomy than they would be if they didn't know that it even existed. And it's your ability to know what you don't know. So you don't show up at a test or a quiz thinking, okay, I'm good, I know this stuff. And then you look at the first 2 or 3 questions like, I guess I'm not so good. And so I want students to understand what these basic tenets of metacognition are so that they see what they're able to do when they are implementing metacognitive strategies. Now, I said that we're going to talk about closing the metacognitive equity gap. And this was the term that I coined after the George Floyd murders, when everybody around the globe really was talking about equity. And of course, educational equity is reducing the discrepancy in educational outcomes between students of different demographics. And I say that metacognitive equity is reducing the discrepancy in the metacognitive skills and the metacognition and the thinking strategies between students from various demographics. Because what I find is that, we have a lot of students who will come to our institutions who are able to perform at higher levels. They're able to analyze and create wonderful pieces, wonderful projects. And then there are other students who don't seem to be able to operate at that higher level. And I submit that it's not because they can't do that. It's just that nobody ever taught them the skills that the students who are performing at these higher levels are. And that's where the metacognitive equity gap comes in. And there are reasons for this. But children from low-income families enter high school with average literacy levels 5 years behind high-income students. They have less access to mentors who are going to model these metacognitive skills and ask questions of them that will require them to operate at higher levels. Students from under-resourced schools are more likely to be not as academically challenged as students from higher resource schools. And minoritized and low-income students are much more likely to have a fixed mindset about intelligence. And there is an impact of privilege on this idea of metacognitive development, because it is through privilege that some students have gained this information, gained the knowledge, and so they have experiences and very well-developed metacognitive abilities that a lot of students don't have. And okay, yes, somebody mentioned the untrained so many students in mathematics, and there's an article, but they knew calculus when they left high school. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but if you Googled that, and it talks about the difference in the way that high school calculus is taught versus college calculus, and there's so many students who've taken high school calculus and have made an A, and then they're thrown for a loop when they take college calculus. And the article is, but they knew calculus when they left high school. Yeah, and Cassandra's is related to the hidden curriculum. Yes, because for so many students, it is hidden. The students have taken a lot of AP courses, a lot of IB courses, then they've had so much experience operating at this level. So the curriculum isn't hidden to them. But for students who haven't had that experience, it is hidden. And so institutions, though, can remedy some of those by really, during college, focusing on developing those metacognitive skills. And sometimes what has to be done is reducing some of the content coverage, especially in introductory courses, and introducing more instruction in terms of metacognitive skills and awareness. And there's a saying, it's been around for a long time, that less is more. That if we concentrate less on covering a lot of stuff, then but focus more on helping students attain the learning skills to analyze and move to higher levels of learning themselves, then that's going to serve them much better in the long run. And I actually think that also would help us with the looking at the gap that we have between the retention from first to second year, which is good, but then the graduation rates being lower, because if we teach those students those skills, then it's going to make a big difference. And the provost mentioned about the diversity here, and you have a very diverse campus. And so it is very likely that when you see this, the metacognitive skills that your students are coming with, there is going to be this huge gap. And so I think that sharing this information with students is going to be very helpful. Now, one of the things, and I can tell you when I first started this, I was not really as familiar with students as I am now, and with what happens to students before they get to our institutions. And so as a way of sharing with you, one of the things that I found, I'm going to ask you how you think students answer the following questions. So just put it in the chat box. So the first one is, when I ask students, what did most of your teachers do the day before the test? Teachers in high school do the day before the test. So put in the chat box what you think they told me. Okay, yes, review, absolutely. I totally expected that. That's exactly what I thought. They would say review. And they did say review, and so no surprises there. But I was shocked by what they said. The answer to the next question was, I asked them, what did the teachers do during the review? And I was blown away. So put in the chat box for me. What do you, yes, Sarah, yes. They gave them the test questions and they went over the answers. Yes. Now I'm surprised. So give me a yes or no in the chat box if you knew that was going on, because I didn't. I was totally blown away. That, okay, yeah, I'm seeing some people like me and they did not know it. Some people did know it. And you know, the first time I asked students this question, it was a group of students at LSU. And I thought it was just Louisiana high schools that were doing this. But I've since asked this question to students in California, New York, Connecticut, not until I had my own middle schooler at home. Yeah, sometimes people say they learned it because of their kids. Sometimes they say they know it because their students are asking them to do it. And for students, teachers who are have just entered the ranks of academia, sometimes they'll say, well, you know, my teachers did that. And you're absolutely right, Sarah. And it's not that high school teachers even want to do this, but they are pressured to make sure that students pass this test. Because I actually asked, you know, well, why would high school teachers do this? And I have a lot of friends who are high school teachers, and they said, well, you know, the system is such that there's so much riding on the grades that students make on the test, and we have to teach to the test, because if we don't and our students don't do well, then, I mean, in some cases, the schools are taken over. Teacher raises are based on test scores. I mean, I think it's I would almost say criminal system, but that's exactly what happens. So it's not the high school teacher's fault, but this is what they're required to do. But be that as it may, this is the situation that's going on. And so when they told me that, then I'm thinking, oh, so then I asked the third question. And I said, okay, well, if you had not gone to class a single day before, just the day before the test, and you went to class that day and you paid very close attention, what grade would you have made on the test the next day? If you'd only gone to class just the day before, but paid really close attention to that. So put in the chat box what grade you think they told me they would. Okay, I'm seeing C. Okay, I'm seeing A, B, B. Okay, yeah. And I asked for a specific letter grade, and they were giving me letter grades. And there were a few students who said A, a few students who said C, but most of them said B. And so then that helped me understand why there were so many students who did not do anything before the first test, because they just figured that, well, the class session before, we're going to have a review session, we're going to get a review sheet, and I'm going to be good to go. And so what that told me was that we as faculty, we're going to have to help students actively engage in learning and help them identify and close that gap between their current behavior that's leading to less than desirable learning and lower grades than they want, and the productive behavior that's going to lead to the desired level of learning and the grades that they are looking for. And the thing that was very surprising to me was how easy it is for us to teach this to students and how much they embrace the information. Okay, yeah, and they're also okay with just a C or B, so why do more work? Yeah, and I think, Erica, a lot of students who say that they're okay with a C or B, they say that because they don't think they can make higher than a C or B, and so it's almost like a psychological defense mechanism, because they don't think they're going to make higher than that, and so they want to be okay with it, and they do think, exactly, low expectations, and they do think that if they do more work, then they're not going to get any advantage out of it because they only have the capacity to do a B or C. And you'll see a Princeton University student who thought the same thing a little bit later on. And so I think there's this kind of vicious cycle where they have low expectations because they don't want to be disappointed. But then when they have these low expectations, they don't put in the work. So then they get low grades, and it's just this vicious cycle. And okay, yeah, a lot of faculty say that, Renee. I wish I'd known this before, but the good news is that we can change it now. And you have a wonderful resource at you. And I keep saying, sometimes I'll say UWM, and I mean UMW instead of UWM. So, but I know University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, and your Student Success Center is absolutely wonderful. And so those folks there know what we're talking about. And in fact, it's an award-winning center. When it was the Panther Academic Support, the PASS program, they were named the Outstanding National College Learning Center Association Outstanding Learning Center. They've won Outstanding Website Awards. And Johnny Dvorak, who is a friend of mine, she was the long-term director of that. She's a emerita now. But put in the chat box, yes, you don't have to put no if you don't know her, but put in the chat box if you know Johnny Dvorak. I think she's been retired. She's been emerita for quite a while. Oh, okay, a lot of people do. Yeah, she is a force of nature, if you know her. In fact, she was at the beginning of when the Midwest College Learning Center Association that actually started in Wisconsin. And Johnny was one of the people who actually had it go national to form NCLCA. She's done a lot of work with online learning, online training, and she is fantastic. And Johnny, if you're here yet, just send me a note in the chat. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of PASS and the resource that it is, because again, when faculty and students work together to improve what we're doing, that's when we're going to see the greatest learning gains. And so what I want to do now is share with you some specific strategies that I have found effective in closing the metacognitive equity gap. And I'm going to do this by introducing you to some students. And the first one is Dana, who is a first-year physics student. And I met Dana at a Change Your Major workshop when she was about to drop out of physics as a major. She was very interested in becoming a medical physicist. She's from Houston, and her mom worked as the MD Anderson Cancer Center. And so she had met a lot of the medical physicists there, and she decided that that's what she wanted to do as a career. But she was about to drop out of physics when she made the 54. And so I talked with her. I'm going to have you listen to her in her own voice. And let's see. Lane, I think I'm going to ask you to unmute your mic and give me a yes or no if you can hear her or not. And let me just tell our colleagues on the line that she starts out very softly, so you'll have to turn your volume all the way up and listen carefully, but you should be able to understand what she's saying. So I'll start talking a little bit more softly so that when you turn your volume up, I won't blow your ears out. And so if you can hear what she's saying, then you'll hear her in her own voice. But I'll just tell you, before metacognition, she was just memorizing formulas using online homework programs. And then you'll hear how she started doing things differently. And so let me make sure that the sound here is all the way up. And I will start Dana so you can hear her in her own voice.
Hi, my name is Dana Lewis Derby, and I am a former student of Dr. McGuire's, and she asked for me to share a little bit of my story with you today. So I met Dr. McGee at a Find Your Major workshop at LSU when I was a freshman. I knew that I wanted to major in physics when I started college, but I quickly found myself failing my introduction to physics class. So I freaked out and thought, you know what, maybe I'm not cut out for this, and decided to attend that workshop. When I went there, I shared my story, and afterwards Dr. McGuire approached me and asked me if I would consider sticking with physics a little while longer and maybe trying to approach my assignments and my tests in a little bit of a different way. So instead of changing my major, I did. I stayed with physics. Her and I began working together, and she began teaching me some of her strategies revolving around metacognition. I quickly learned that my method of trying to memorize material in order to pass assignments and tests just was not going to cut it. I had to really learn the ability to problem solve, and I essentially had to relearn how to study. I was reading chapters differently, making notes, and essentially completing homework assignments like I had to teach the material to someone else, with the thought behind that being, if you can teach it, then you really do know what you're talking about. After working with Dr. McGuire for a full semester, I ended up making an A in my physics course, and I went on to graduate with my bachelor's in physics from LSU with honors, all with Dr. McGuire's help. So I didn't quite know that going to one workshop was going to be so instrumental in setting me up for success throughout my entire college career. My life would be very, very different if I had not met Dr. McGuire that day and implemented the strategies that she taught me. She is absolutely phenomenal, and she really does have the golden ticket of information that's going to push you towards optimal success. So I hope that you enjoy the workshop today. Thanks for listening, and best of luck. Bye.
Okay, yes, and I wanted you to hear Dana in her own voice, but there are two things that she said that are very misleading. One is she said that after working with me for a whole semester, she was able to do well. Now, we did work together for the whole semester. In fact, longer than that, because I became her mentor, but I only talked with her one time about metacognition and effective strategies. And then the other thing she said, which isn't true, she said that I'm phenomenal. And it's not me that's phenomenal, it's the strategies that are phenomenal. And I can guarantee you that when you share these strategies with students, they will say that you're phenomenal, because it turns out that these strategies are pretty much paradigm shifting for students. They don't know why they're floundering. We give them these strategies, they start to implement them, and they see this immediate, really pretty immediate and dramatic improvement in performance. And they think that we're phenomenal, but it's really the strategies. And so what I was able to share with Dana, in addition to talking about metacognition, was a strategy that I find is the thing that derails a lot of our students on the tests and quizzes. And that is the way they do their homework. And so I'm going to ask you to think back to the last time you were doing homework and put in the chat box, yes or no, if you ever did this. Did you ever read a problem that you had to work or a question that you had to answer, and then flip back in the chapter to find an example of the question of the problem that you had to work, or a discussion of the question you had to answer? If you ever did that, put yes in the chat box. And if you never did it, put no. Okay, and I'm seeing lots of yeses. When I do this with students, yeah, I see the exclamation point. Yeah, they'll say, yeah, it was so long ago, Lane says. And I do see one no, and I applaud the person who did not, because there are certain people, like my husband, never did that. He's a physics professor, as you heard, but I did it all the time. And our students are doing this. And so, and I tell them, yes, I said, I did this too. And I said, now, unfortunately, here's the situation. And I asked, when we did this, and this is the next question for you, when we did that, was our brain working the problem or answering the question on the homework? Give me a yes or no on that. Because the problems were getting worked, the questions were getting answered, because, okay, so I'm sorry. No, the question is, if when we had a question we had to answer, if we flipped back in the chapter and read a discussion of that, or if we looked at an example of the problem, yes or no, was our brain actually doing the work to answer the question or to work the problem? So that's the question. Okay, no, absolutely. Okay, and students will say no in a minute. And that was the other good thing. This whole process really depends on asking students reflection questions as opposed to telling them what to do. If we ask them questions that will take them back to their own experience so that they see that what we're suggesting, they see how it's going to make a difference, then that really makes it much more likely that they're going to implement the strategies. And so when I ask, was our brain working the problem? I say no. And so then I'll ask, well, what was working the problem or answering the question? Because we turned in the homework and, I got fine scores on homework, but my brain wasn't working the problem or answering the question. So what was? And so let me ask you to put in the chat box, what was doing the work to answer the questions or work the problems if our brains were not, and they were not? So what was working? Yes, in fact, and yeah, they say, yeah, the textbook. They'll say the textbook, they'll say the author, they'll say the example, the discussion, etc. And I said, yeah. But now if you're like me, and I said, I know you are, because you are really, really bright students, you would not be at UWM if you were not. And so I said, do you remember thinking when you looked at how the example was worked or just read the discussion thinking, oh yeah, I understand that. Oh yeah, I got that. And they all shake their heads yes, or put yes in the chat box. And so I said, yeah, I thought the same thing. But if they changed anything at all around on when we got to the test or quiz, what happened? And sometimes they'll put oops in the chat box, or they'll shake their head no if I'm in person. Or one young man said, oop, I don't got that. And so the strategy that I teach students to use for doing their homework, which now makes homework a learning experience as opposed to just an exercise to do to turn in the homework. Before you look at the first problem or question, you got to study the information. And most students don't do that. They go right to the first problem or question, but you have to study the material. And if you've done that, then study it as if it's going to be on a test or a quiz the next day. So you're really trying to master the material as you're studying it. And so when you do that, you will get to, if it's the notes, you'll get to example problems, whether it's your notes or the textbook. You'll see example problems, or in the textbook, there's little thought questions, why do you think this might have happened? And so I ask students, what do you do now if you're using your textbook or your notes and you get to an example or get to one of these little thought questions? What do you do? And put in the chat box what you think students said they did. And I will see if you are much more in tune with students than I was. Okay, yes. And so actually, John, the question was, when they're reading their book or their notes, when they see an example, when they come to an example, what did they do? And it was, let's see who said it. It was Angel, who, I think, who said it. Yeah, and Ann said, skip it. They were all telling me that they were skipping it. And I was surprised because I never skipped the examples. I would actually go and I would actually read what the author did. But now, and actually we're not there at this point, there's nothing for them to Google or to YouTube. They're just reading the book or they're reading the notes. And as they're doing that, they're coming across examples that the textbook author has provided or that the instructor has put in the notes. And so, yeah, so they're skipping it. So I tell them, you got to commit to yourself that you will never skip another example, because the examples are your brain's best resource for convincing itself that it can work these problems, it can answer these questions. And but you've got to give your brain a chance to do that. And so when you get to an example, just look at the problem and start it, go all the way through until you get an answer. Even if you're not sure exactly what to do next, just power your way through until you get a solution. And then, and if it's a question, just write down as much as you possibly can to answer the question. And then after you've done that, if it's a problem, just compare the answer that you got with the answer that's in the book. If you got the same answer, then you can look at what the author did. But if you didn't get the same answer, don't look yet. Try to figure out where your mistake was. And then I ask students at that point, if you make a mistake, and John says, I think I meant that many examples, I see a work through in online videos. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. But for some reason, they just ignore the examples. And it'd be even better, if they looked at how the examples were worked in online videos, but most of them aren't even doing that. They're just totally skipping the examples. And so when I tell them, to work it until you get to a solution or write down everything, and then compare what you wrote, if it's a question, with the answer in the book, see if there was anything that you left out or anything that the textbook has that you didn't, and figure out, what that difference is. But if it's a problem, when you compare just the answer to the answer in the book, if you got the same answer, then you can look at what the author did. But if you didn't, don't look yet, try to figure out where your mistake was. And then I'll ask students, at this point in the process, do you think making a mistake is good or bad? And put in the chat box what you think students tell me. Is making a mistake at this point good or bad? Do you think students say? Okay, you are like your faculty colleagues all over this country, other countries too. Faculty always say students say bad. I have never had a student audience that said bad. Students always say good. But I'm sure it's because of the way that I set it up. If I just came and asked them, is making a mistake good or bad? They're going to say bad. But the way we've set it up like this, they say good. And then I'll say, you're absolutely right. Yes, it's good. I said, but now don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's bad if you don't make a mistake at this point. It's fantastic if you don't make a mistake at this point. But why is it good if you make a mistake at this point? And they are so dead on. Why would it be good? And I'm not asking you now to tell me what they say, but why? And I'm assuming that we would all say it's good if you make a mistake at this point. And M.T. Harris has already said you learn the most. It's a learning opportunity. Experiential learning, must make mistakes to learn. Okay, mistakes are good if you learn from your mistakes. Okay, so you've essentially put the three things that I get from students. The first thing they say is you learn from your mistakes. And I said, absolutely right. Then the second thing they tell me, they say, well, now I know where my brain is having a tendency to go wrong. And then the last thing they'll say, and I don't know that I've seen it in the chat box yet, mistakes reveal what I still need to learn or work on. Yeah, they say, now I know where my brain is going wrong. The culture of taking those risks has to change. Yeah, and actually, you're right, Christine. And so I like to characterize mistakes as opportunities for learning. And so I think, yeah, and there's, I think, a lot in the culture now to kind of change that. Now, there's a third reason that students give, and I don't think I've seen in the chat box yet, why a mistake would be good at this point. Anybody have an idea of why? Oh, thanks, Adiola. Yeah, because I do a lot more with neurodivergent thinkers now, and I didn't realize yet that. Okay. Yeah. So why? Yes, there you go, Thomasina. Yeah, they will say it's not the test, and they'll say, "Yep, Sarah, I have time to fix it." And then that gives me the opportunity to address this phenomenon and put in the chat box yes or no if you've ever had a student do this, where they get a test back, haven't done great on it, they look at it and they say, I would have done so much better, but I just made so many simple mistakes. I just made simple mistakes. Have you heard students say that? Okay, yes, I hear them say that. And so I will ask students, have you ever gotten the test or quiz back and you looked at it and you said, I would have done better, just simple mistakes. And they say, oh yeah. And I used to think the same thing, I tell them. I said, but now I have a very different attitude. My philosophy now is that there's no such thing as just simple mistakes. Mistakes only look simple in retrospect. Once you know what the right thing is, your mistake looks so simple. But mistakes are things that have to be made. And if you don't make them during this process, Where are you going to make them? And what do you think students tell? And how do they answer that question when I say, if you don't make the mistake during this process, where are you going to make the mistake? And what do they tell me? And I'm waiting for an answer. Exactly. Yes. On the next test, even they'll say on the test. And so what that says is, I'm not telling students, you better do this or you're going to screw up on the test. They're telling me, if I don't do this, I'm going to suffer on the test. So it's much more likely that they will implement the strategy. And so let this catch up check to see if it's correct. If it's not, figure out where the mistake was made. And that's just the examples I tell them. When you get to the actual homework problems, treat it as if it's a test or a quiz. Try to do 3 or 4, speed it up a little bit, answer 2 or 3 questions. Put yourself in the environment that you will be in when you're taking a test, because so many students run out of time on a test, not because they haven't really learned the information, but they're going so slowly. They're plodding very slowly through it to make sure they don't make any mistakes, because they have as much time as they need on homework. So you've got to practice speeding it up. And this is what Dana did. And it was this strategy. I'm going to say 90% of what we're talking about today, I did not know until I got to LSU and started working with students. But this one strategy I learned when I was teaching the engineering students at Cornell, and other students chemistry also, that the number one reason that my students were making C's, D's, and sometimes F on exams that they could have been making A's and B's on was because of the way that they were doing their homework. And so now I'm going to share another strategy with you now. And this is a reading strategy, because I'm finding that so many students now don't have great reading strategies. And so, in fact, give me a yes or no in the chat box. Have you found that reading is a problem for some of your students? Oh, okay, I'm seeing yes with exclamation point. Absolutely. Okay, great. And so this hopefully will be able to help you the way it helped me. Now, I learned these strategies by going to a 4-week summer workshop on reading strategies. It was done by the Institute of Reading Development, IRD. They were doing these workshops all over. And I took that workshop because there were so many students at LSU coming to our center wanting us to teach them how to be more effective readers. These were law school students, grad school students, undergrad students. And, you know, I was a chemistry professor. I didn't know how to teach people how to read. And so I went to this workshop and learned invaluable information, why we don't get the most out of our reading. And so I'll just take you through this. So give me a yes or no in the chat box. Have you ever sat down to read something and you start to read and you get a little ways in and your mind starts to wander? Does that ever? Okay, many times. And students said absolutely. And so then I'll ask now, and if you're like me, I don't even realize that my mind is wandering until I've gotten 2 or 3 paragraphs down the road, because I'm what's called a sub-vocalizer. So I can actually hear the words in my head and I'm not paying attention. And so when you realize that, I'm not paying attention, I don't know what I just read, what do you tend to do at that point? Once you've realized that your mind is wandering, you've missed some stuff, what do you do? Put that in the chat box for me. What do you, yes, reread, go back. Exactly. That's what most students say. Now, some of them say, I close the book. And so I tell students that, well, yeah, you know, sometimes you do have to take a break, but most of the time you don't really have that luxury. You know, you have to do the get through the reading. And so I can tell you a way to prevent that. And it's the idea that if we prepare our brains for reading before we start to read, then it's much less likely that our mind is going to wander. And part of that is giving our brain the big picture of what we are about to read before we start. Because we know from the cognitive science literature that whenever the brain is trying to learn something new, if it starts with an overview, a big picture, and then gets individual details to fill in that big picture, it's much more efficient than if it starts out getting the individual details, trying to form its own big picture. And so in order to give your brain that big picture, you've got to preview the text before you start to read. Look at the boldface print, the italicized words, any charts or graphs, or if it's a novel or something that doesn't have those markers, you can read maybe the first line of 5 or 6 paragraphs to try to give your brain that big picture. And then after you have gotten that big picture, then come up with questions that you want the reading to answer for you. For example, if I were reading a book, a chapter on acids and bases, I would see strong acid, strong base, weak base in boldface, print, or italicized words. And so I might say, well, I wonder what this thing is going to say is the difference between strong acids and weak acids. Does one burn you more than another? I don't know. This is what I'm going to find out. Yes, Angel, the point of headings and subheadings. And we actually have to teach students how to use those markers, because many of our students, and put in the chat box, yes or no, if you knew this, many students do not use textbooks at all in high school. So we have students who come to our institutions, they've never used a textbook. They don't know that there's an index in a book. They don't know how to use the table of contents. Absolutely. And so as much as we can do, and I love that strategy, Christine, that analogy you're making, as much as we can do to help them understand how to use that, that's very, very helpful. And yeah, Erica, one of the things about writing, I think the best writers are the people who've done a lot of reading. And if we can help them understand how subheadings are used and useful in their reading, then I think more of them are going to translate that to being able to use it in their own writing. So very good point. And so, come up with those questions that are going to focus the reading. And then when you start to read, just read the first paragraph, stop, put that information in your own words, and then read the next paragraph, stop, put that information in your own words, and try to fold in what was in the paragraph before, and then read subsequent paragraphs the same way. Now, at this point in the discussion, I always stop and I ask students, does it sound like if I got to do all that, it's going to take a long time to finish the reading? So put in the chat box for me, please. Does it sound like going through this process? Yes. Okay. I'm already seeing the yeses. And students say yes. And it sounds like it, but students love this thing. And so, what I tell students to do is, in fact, I don't even have to tell them to come back and let me know how it worked. They would contact me and they say, boy, this was so helpful. And so then I say, okay, that's great. I'm glad it's working for you. They said, I'm getting so much more out of my reading now. I said, but are you finding that it's taking you longer to finish your reading using this process than what you were doing before? And to a person, they say, well, no, I'm actually finishing my reading sooner than I did before. And you have already put the answers in the chat box to my next question. And then I usually ask faculty, why do you think it would take less time to get through the reading doing all of this than what they were doing before? And I ask students this, and they'll say, well, I'm not doing all that rereading. And that's true. The old way, you would read a little bit, but then you have to go back, read, go back, read, go back, read, go back, read, go back. Now, this way, you are moving more slowly through the material, but you get to the end point faster, and because you're not doing all that back and forth. And absolutely, Johnny is here. Okay, yes, Johnny says, their minds don't wander. So students will tell me I'm more focused because of the questions that I've come up with. And they have placeholders for the information they're taking in. So this is actually an active reading process. And again, students love it. And so it can be summarized in something that's called SQ5R. It was SQ3R when I first learned it, and then it went up to 4R, 5R. In fact, there's an SQ6R now. But even if you're teaching students SQ3R or 4R, it works because students right now don't have a process for the way they do their reading. So the first thing is to get that survey, get the big picture, come up with questions, then do your reading one paragraph at a time while you're summarizing it in your own words. And then you can teach them how to record or annotate in the margins. And then the next R is for review. When you get to the end of a section, then review that whole section. And then the very last R is for reflect. Are there any other views? Do you have any remaining questions? And I'll give you an example of that. Is the book saying something that really is not going to be applicable in your situation? So for example, if students were in, I see we have some nursing faculty on the line. And so if there were a course on community nutrition, let's say, because we're going to try to help our clients be more proactive with their health and eat healthier so that they are less likely to see these complications from hypertension, diabetes, all these things. And so the textbook says, tell all of your clients that they need to eat a diet that is very rich in fresh fruits and vegetables. Well, as you're reading that, you're seeing, that your clients live in a food desert. So they don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. So what can you tell them that's going to be beneficial to their nutrition and health other than what's in the book? Because what's in the book, they can't do. And so then you're thinking, okay, well, frozen fruits and vegetables are an option, canned are an option. So you're reflecting on that. And that makes a huge, huge difference. And so what I'm going to do now, the other thing I like to do is I like to give students an experience where they see that what I'm suggesting is going to make a difference for them, because then that motivates them more to take action. So on the next slide, there's going to be a short passage that I'm going to give you a minute or so to read. Then I'm going to take it off and ask you a question about it. So let's read this. Okay, you might not have finished the whole thing, but I think you've read enough. And so put in the chat box for me, yes or no. If I asked you, would you be able to do this? If I asked you to unmute your mic and summarize the content in that passage to the group, would you be able to do that? Okay, I'm saying no. And students say, okay, Sarah says, yikes. It would be BS. I've never seen that response. Okay. And I certainly would not have been able to do that. But let me ask you this. If you had known before you started to read that this was about flying a kite, now I want you to read it again and put in the chat box yes or no if it makes more sense to you now that you know what you're reading about. Okay, and this is what students say. They said, absolutely. Oh, yes. Yeah, it context. And so I tell students that if you take the few minutes that are required to do that overview, do the preview, then that's going to give you the context that you're going to be doing the reading in, and you're going to be able to understand things so much better. And this is the reference for that, and here's the web link to that. And so, oh, thank you, Devin. Well played. And again, this is the kind of thing that we have to do with students, because if we just tell them, you need to do the preview, you need to do this, and they haven't seen how well it works, then they're less likely to implement it. And this is a text that was forwarded to me from a college admissions reviewer. It was from a letter of recommendation that was written by a physics teacher who had this student who was not doing well in physics. She wanted to drop to a lower level course. And she asked her how she was reading the book, and she found out she was reading it like a novel. She told her, don't give up yet. And she gave her the reading strategy. And she said it worked. Not only did that turn her around in her class, but she applied the same technique in the other classes, and she saw her grades go up. Now she's found confidence, knows what to do. Jemiah will do nothing but exceptional work in college. And it's that confidence that these strategies will help students develop. And you can see this young lady had absolutely no confidence that she was going to be able to do well in this course. So she wanted to drop to a lower level class. And I think that's what's happening to a lot of the UWM students after that first year, when things start to get difficult and they think that they can't master it. And so then they're much more likely to maybe even leave the institution. And so I mentioned earlier that reflection questions are the key to this, because students have to live through their own experience as we're discussing it with them. And so one of the questions that I asked students, there are two that I have found are very impactful. One is, and I'm going to ask you to put in the chat box your answers to this. The first one, what's the difference? What would you say is the difference between studying and learning? And I'm going to see if the three primary reasons that students give me. I'm going to see if you give me the same 3 or different ones. So just put in the chat box. And again, it's important for me to let students know, and I'm going to let you know, there are no right or wrong answers. So whatever you put is fine. But what would you say is the difference between studying and learning? Okay, process learning to achieve, apply this to novel conditions. Okay, taking in information and learning, then applying. Okay, studying is knowing, understanding. Okay, learning, okay, and engages hands, learning engages minds. Okay, yeah, and there's one word that the #1 answer I get from students, okay, retention, that I haven't seen in the chat box yet, that they describe studying as. They'll say, studying is just this particular word, whereas they'll say learning is yeah, there it is, Renee. Yes, memorize. So students will say, and then wanting to pass. Okay, so the 3 things that students tell me, they'll say studying is just memorizing information for a test or a quiz, but learning is when I understand that information, I can apply it, I can use it in other contexts. Sometimes they'll say studying is short term, learning is long term, which gets at what Nicholas just said, wanting to pass, because one young lady actually said, studying is what I do the night before the test to make an A. But learning is what I do if I know I've got to use that information later. Studying is an action, learning is a permanent change. Yeah. And so, and the other thing sometimes they'll say is studying is tedious, learning is fun. But they see there's a difference. And so when I say, okay, and nobody ever discussed this difference with them, because we tell students, you know, when they're in high school, you need to study, you need to study. And we never make this distinction between studying and learning. But when we ask the question, they will say, this is memorizing versus understanding. And so then I ask students, now that we've got that distinction, up to this point in time, have you been more in study mode or more in learn mode? And what do you think students tell me? Have they been up to this point more in study mode or in learn mode? Yes, study, absolutely. And you're right, Connie. I saw Connie's comment about that. They think that memorizing is knowing. And that's true until they see Bloom's taxonomy, which is what we're going to do in a little bit. Yeah, they're in study mode. Absolutely. Now, the next one, I'll just kind of summarize it. It's more in detail when I give students the scenarios, but I'll just summarize it and ask, would you work harder if I told you you had to make an A on the next test? Or if I said that the class period before the next test, we're going to have a review session, and you are going to teach that review session. You're going to go over all the important concepts, paying particular attention to the more difficult concepts to make sure everybody's prepared for the test the next day. Would you work harder for A or B? Okay, yes, and most students say B, although some students do say A. And when students say A, I will ask them, you know, why do you say A? And I find that most of the students who say A are actually studying the right way. They'll say, if I got to make an A on the test, I know that I have to know everything. I've got to write everything out. And so they're doing it the right way. But other students will say, well, it's my grade, or, you know, I've got to do well. And then when I ask students, why would you work harder for B? And I'm going to ask you to put that in the chat box for me, please, because pretty much everybody said B. So why would you work harder for B than for A if you had to teach the material? And there are 3 main reasons I get from students about this. Okay, everyone will know what I know. The responsibility is greater. Okay, we're responsible for others' learning. Public embarrassment. Okay, yes, I've seen 2 of them now. Don't want to embarrass, peer pressure, feel embarrassed. Interesting. And so I think that the one that I'm not seeing is probably just so second nature to you that you didn't even put it in there. But it's the #1 answer I get from students. They'll say, well, I have to really understand it. There you go, Sarah. Yeah, they said, I really have to know it if I have to teach it. And sometimes faculty laugh at that. And it's like, well, didn't they know they had to know it in order to make an A on the test? And as we saw earlier, no, they didn't, because their experience has not taken them through that. And so then and then I asked, up to this point, have you been more in scenario A mode? Have you been studying to make A's on tests? Or have you been preparing to teach the material? What mode do you think they tell me that they have most often been in? Put that in the chat box for me, A or B. Yeah, they've all been in A. And what I do at this point, as I said, yes, wonderful. I love it when you're doing everything wrong. Because if you're doing everything wrong, then it's much more likely that now that you change some things, you're going to see huge benefits. And one of the reasons I do that is I never want students to feel bad about what they have been doing, because it wasn't their fault. Nobody ever had this discussion with them before. And so I don't want students to think that I'm chastising them. How could you have been just memorizing for an A? No, I'm glad if that's what you're doing, because now we have great potential for seeing great improvement. And the other thing I like to do is I like to share with students the experience of other students who've used these strategies and what the impact has been. And so there was one young man who heard this discussion when I was presenting to a class, and he came up afterwards, and he liked this idea about teaching the information. And so he told me he had a beta fish in his room. And this is actually a picture of his beta fish, of Ty's beta fish. And he was going to start teaching the information to his beta fish. And a little over a month later, he sent me an email. His bio exam grades had gone from 66 to 98, came from 62 to 83. He ended up with a B in both courses. And by then I was asking students to send me an email to tell me exactly what they did differently. And this is what they did. And I know you have a very robust supplemental instruction program that Johnny started in past, and now it's still going on. And we have a lot of SI courses here, but many times, that's why tutors and SI leaders benefit so much, exactly because they have to help students understand. Exactly. We always say that the students who benefit most from tutoring and SI are the tutors and the SI leaders. And so we use that information in tutor and SI leader training to help the tutors pose these questions to students. And actually, when students come in, to ask students to explain things to them so that the students get the benefit of that. But he started going to more of the sessions. Before, he would go through them kind of sporadically. And before this, he did not do anything to prepare for the sessions. But now after this, he started preparing. He would see what he knew and what he didn't know, so that when he went to those sessions, he would know exactly what he needed to focus on to understand. And then after those sessions, he went to his room and taught the materials to his beta fish, and anything he couldn't explain, he studied more, and he just continued that cycle until he could explain everything in his notes. And John says, practice giving lectures to my cat. We had a veterinary school student who was flunking animal physiology, and she talked to us. She made an A in the course. And so I asked her, what did you do? And so she said, Dr. McGuire, I have the smartest dog in animal physiology on the planet. She said, every day after class, I would go and teach him what we had learned that day. And so, but see, students normally would not think to use this unless we have this discussion with them. Okay, now another part of the process is I need students to believe as fervently as I do that they can be making an F one day and an A 3 weeks later if they use these strategies. And so there's a little exercise that I give them. And in the books, the exercises are different, but there are exercises there too. And so I'm going to do this one with you that demonstrates how fast and rapid improvement can be made. So on the next slide after this one, not this one, but on the next slide after this one, you're going to see a whole bunch of numbers all jumbled up. And I want you to first locate the number 1, and then find the number 2, and then lay your eyes on the number 3. Find them in sequential order. I'm going to give you 15 seconds to do it. And when 15 seconds are up, I'm going to take them off the screen and ask you to put in the chat box, what was the last number you saw when you were finding them in sequential order? So let's start finding the numbers now. And stop. Okay, so put in the chat box the last number you saw. Okay, 5, not yet. Normally I get single digits or very low double digits. I saw 10. Okay, so we didn't find very many. Now I want you to look at it again with this horizontal line and a vertical line and the position of the number 1. And so now you will notice that when you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, the numbers are arranged according to something. So just put in the chat box what they are arranged according to. What do you know? Yeah, quadrants. Okay, Christine says quadrants. Sometimes people say clockwise. Students, yeah, there's the clockwise, Jen says. Students don't usually say clockwise because most of them can't read analog clocks. They are into digital clocks, but yeah, they'll say clockwise. And so say, yeah, so the 1 is here, the 2, the 3, etc. And so now I'm going to give you 15 seconds to, again, start with one, but find as many as you can. That's right. I'm so old, I guess. I can read a clock, but digital clocks have been around for a while. So not a problem, Jen. There are enough digital resources around that's not going to be a problem. Okay, so now I'm going to give you 15 seconds to start at the 1 and then find as many, and then we'll see how we do this time. So let's start finding the numbers now. And stop. Okay, and put in the chat box the number you found this time. Wow, 27, 17, 23, 16. Okay, yeah. So it looks like everybody got at least twice what they got the first time. In the exercise in the book, most people get 3 times as many. Okay, so Nicholas, 21 blackjacks. You're like some of my students, Nicholas. I love the humor though. And so what this demonstrates to students, I say, is, we're not any smarter people in the room than we were a minute ago when our score was half what it is now. But just as we could double our score on this, that means that if you got 45 on the first test, you can get 90 on the next test. And there was a reason, though, that we could get so much better. We got so much better on the second attempt. And what was that? What were some major differences between the first? Yes, we had a strategy, exactly. We knew where to look, exactly. We knew the pattern, we knew how the information was organized, and we could look at a smaller section of the grid because we knew where to look. And so I tell students, that's what the goal is in courses. We have to know how the information is organized. We've got to know, how does the information in chapter 5 relate to the information in chapter 2? And that's also why you've got to study every night. You can't wait until the night before the test where now you got to look at the whole thing. But if you're concentrating on smaller amounts, then you're going to be able to master that material better. Now, when I first started, I did not know most of this stuff. So I started reading everything I could get my hands on when I found out that this was possible. How People Learn is a very valuable resource. And then in 2018, they came out with How People Learn 2, Learners, Contexts, and Cultures. And this has information on culturally responsive teaching. And these are both great resources. Now, we know a lot about learning now that we did not know 40, 50 years ago. We know that active learning is much more lasting than passive learning. That's why it's so important to do this, asking students reflection questions, getting them actively engaged in the discussion. We know that thinking about thinking is important. Teaching students about metacognition and using the term metacognition is important. And in fact, the person who used to be head of the Academic Center for Student Athletes at LSU actually turned it into a verb. He said, Dr. McGuire, I'm talking to these football players, and when they come in, I say, guys, we're gonna metacognate today. We're gonna do some metacognating today. And so they understood what that meant, that they were going to be doing some analyzing and thinking about their own thinking. And then the level at which learning occurs is important. And that's where Bloom's taxonomy comes in. And most of us said that we were very familiar, but there were a few of us who were not. And so it's just really a hierarchy of learning levels. Although when Benjamin Bloom and colleagues developed this in 1957 at the University of Chicago, they really didn't intend for it to be hierarchical. And it doesn't have to be, because there's some wonderful artisans who create great work who know nothing about the theory of what they're doing. And so you don't have to know everything before you get here. So it's not necessarily hierarchical. But I like this because it shows that remembering is the base, that it's important to know something. Because I have more students now saying, well, Dr. McGuire, back in your day, y'all had to memorize stuff, but we can look stuff up on the net, so we don't have to memorize stuff. And I try to help them understand that you can't solve problems with information you have just looked up on the net. You have to have information in your brain. And then it goes to understanding, to being able to apply, then to being able to analyze, breaking concepts down into simpler parts, and then evaluating, knowing whether one way of doing something is better than another, one explanation is better than another, and then to creating. And I find that when we teach students about Bloom's, they actually get it. Now, here's the next poll question that, very fast. Thanks so much, Lane. When I ask students, when I explain Bloom's taxonomy to them, and I ask them to think back to high school, and I ask them, what level did you have to operate to make A's and B's in your high school courses? And yeah, you're answering that question for me. And when we get to about 70%, I will give you the 5-second warning. And I can see right now that you are right in tune with the answers that I see from students. And okay, I see some people are actually doing it in the chat box. So we're right about 50%. I'll end it now because you are, and I'll share the results. Students do say pretty much remembering and understanding. And there are some that go higher. Students who've had AP courses or IB courses, that's the case. But then I asked them, now that you have been in college for a while, because I like to present this information after students have gotten either the first test or quiz back, so they now see the level that they're going to be required to operate at UWM. What level do you think you need to operate to make the A's here? The A's that you're totally capable of making. You're just as smart as you ever were. It's just that we've now moved to higher levels. And now that you know what those levels are and you see where you were in high school, now what do we have to do here? And you are right on target with students. We're right at about 40%, and I will let us get up to 50%, and then I will end the poll and share the results. And we are just about there. I need one more person to vote. And yeah, there we are. Okay. And you'll see that applying, analyzing, evaluating. And when students do this, I say, now that's the third piece of the puzzle. The reason that you were not making the A's that you're capable of making, learning that you are totally capable of achieving, is because you were in study mode, not learn mode. You were memorizing information to make A's on tests instead of preparing to teach the information. And now we see that you were at lower levels of Bloom's. And we have a remedy for that. And and I was just going to show you the results from when I was using clickers to capture the information. This was one group in high school. The big bump was at 2, but for in college, it was at 6. This group, it was at 1 for high school, and then 5 for college. And we showed them how to move higher using this thing that we call the study cycle. 5-step process, students love this. Preview before you go to class, review after class, and then we showed them how to focus their study sessions, and then once a week check for their learning. And students love this because, put in the chat box for me, have you had students who say, I just really don't know how to study? I just don't know how to study. Because I would hear that all the time. And sometimes they'll give us a reason. They'll say, well, I really don't know how to study because, and put in the chat box if you've heard of because. I just don't really know how to study because, and there are 2 things that I hear. Exactly, Lane. Yeah, no one ever taught me. That's one of the ones. And then the other thing they said, because I never had to, is the other thing I hear. And and this is one young lady who said that those focused study sessions help her the most. Okay, yeah, and Erica, you said you provide one, but they don't use it. And so I'm going to suggest taking them through this discussion, because if we just give them the information, then they probably won't do that. The way I've been, I've been successful. Yeah, now that's a good point, Angel. If they've been successful already and they don't need to change anything, then they're not. But, you know, if it's not working in your class, then they need to change it. And this is just an engineering professor who just shared the PowerPoint with Bloom's and the study cycle, and great results. This student got 114% on first and only graded assignment, got 100% on the test. And so we are just about to come to a close, but I wanted to say just a little bit about this mindset. So put in the chat box, yes or no, if you're familiar with Carol Dweck's work on mindset. Okay, and so it seems that most people are. Yeah, she and her group look at the view of intelligence that most people have, either that your intelligence is fixed, it's not going to change very much, or you can grow your intelligence with your actions. And that's so important, because if we have a fixed mindset, then the behaviors are very different than if we have a growth mindset. We avoid challenges, give up very easily, see effort as pointless, ignore useful negative feedback, feel threatened when others are successful. Whereas if we have a growth mindset, we embrace challenges, persist in the face of setbacks. We know effort is the path to mastery. We learn from constructive criticism, and we're inspired when others are successful. Now, last 2 poll questions. what mindset do you think most students have, fixed or growth? And I will see, okay, the results are coming in. We're already at just about 50%. So I will give us 5 more seconds. And okay, yeah, and I'll show you the results in the poll and share the results. Yeah, and most of us said fixed. And of course, you know, not all students are fixed, but many of them are, because we socialize students to have a fixed mindset when we tell them, you know, from very early on, you're really, really smart or you're not so smart. And I was telling our one of the faculty members in the honors program, I find that honors students have a very fixed mindset because they were always told they were smart. And when they flounder, then they that's a big problem. Now, the last poll question, what mindset about student intelligence do you think most faculty have, fixed or growth? And okay, so the results are coming in. We are getting there. And I can tell you, I was one of these faculty members who had a very fixed mindset. The student had flunked my first 2 tests in organic chemistry, told me that they wanted to be a brain surgeon. What could they do? I would say, let's talk about your backup plan. And I repent of that now. I'm sorry I said that, but I didn't know the strategies that I know now. Okay, and so let me end the poll and share the results. And yeah, so you're about 50-50. Many times I talk with faculty and a lot more of them say growth, but I think a lot of us as faculty do have a fixed mindset, and it's important that now I do have a very growth mindset because I've seen that it can happen. Student who had a fixed mindset, thought he couldn't do well in chemistry. I had 1 session with him. These were his grades before, then the grades after, ended up with an A in the course, and he had started with a D before we talked. There's a study that links faculty attitudes on intelligence to student success in STEM with a large impact on minoritized students. And here in this study, and here's the website for it, but they found that all students in the classroom of a faculty member with a growth professor did better, and it cut the gap between the Black, Latino, and Native American students and the white and Asian students in half. So it's addressing this metacognitive equity gap. Here's the email from the Princeton student where she was from a public high school. She was making B's and C's. She and her colleagues from public high schools thought that that was their lot at Princeton, that only the students from the elite private high schools would make A's. But she read the mindset chapter in the book, and she said it was so important, because before that, she thought if you're smart, you're smart. If you're from a private high school, you're set, but from a public high school, you can't even grow. But she used the strategies, and she said, that's one example of going from literally getting C's of my freshman year and thinking I shouldn't even be at Princeton and majoring in neuroscience, to getting all A's while taking all neuroscience courses my senior year. If it wasn't for the growth mindset, she knows that now she wouldn't even be there. And the last example I want to show you is a person, this was a graduate student who was not passing the cumulative exams. They've got to pass 6 in the first 2 years. He'd only passed 1 his first year. And then he learned the strategies, passed 5 out of 7 the next year, didn't even need the last 1. And this is he, Dr. Algernon Kelly. Take a good look at this guy. He's the only person, I think, on the planet who has a PhD in chemistry. And he started every single college course at the developmental level. And so when he left LSU, he shares these strategies everywhere he goes. And I like to end with these last 3 emails. October 17th, the student writes, I'm struggling, really want to do well. I was hoping you could mentor me and guide me down the path that will help me reach my true potential. Because students who are not doing well know they're not reaching their true potential, but they don't know how to fix it. 1 week later, made an 84 on my chem exam compared to 52 on the first one. November 3rd, increased bio from 76 to 91.5. Ever since I started your study cycle program, my grades have significantly improved. Honestly, I've gained a sense of hope and confidence. And that's what we want our students to get back, because that's what they lose when they flounder on those first tests or quizzes. And he says, my family and I are really grateful that you've taken the time to get me back on track. Students from first-gen families, when they flounder, they don't know how to fix it. And they bring the hopes and dreams of their families with them to college. They don't know how to fix floundering. The families don't, but this information will. So basically, we really can significantly increase student learning, but we got to teach our students how to learn. We can't judge their potential on their initial performance. We can't let them do it either. We've got to encourage them to persist even when they initially fail, and we've got to motivate them. Okay, yes, and Johnny says, we've taught these strategies to the tutors and SI leaders for them to incorporate. And I'm going to finish in 1 minute, I promise, because I know you have other things to do. But there's one story I want to end with. These are some acknowledgments. And this is the book for faculty, the book for students, the new parents guide that just came out. And so I want to just take a minute to tell you this story that I share with students. And it's a true story that happened at a dinner party in Germany back in the 1930s. There was a Swiss aerodynamic scientist at the party, and he got bored at the party. And so he started thinking about things that fly. He's an aerodynamic scientist. He started thinking about bumblebees. He's thinking, why should bees be able to fly? They've got this huge body, relatively small wings compared to the length of the body. They don't have a long sleek body and long wings like a wasp does. And here's another vantage point: big, huge body, very short wings. Yes, there is a reading list, and I know CELT has some, but also in the references that are on there, those are good readings also. But with the book, Teach Students How to Learn. Okay, and so the bumblebee, though, he did calculations on his napkin showing that there's no way that with the size of the wings and the size of the body, bumblebees shouldn't be able to fly. Did the calculations over and over, got the same thing. And when I talk to students, I say that, the good news is that bumblebees do not know any aerodynamic science. And since they don't know any aerodynamic science, they don't know they're not supposed to be able to fly. So they just keep right on flying. And so I tell the students, when you meet someone who says you're not going to be able to do something, then just treat it like the bumblebee. They are miscalculating. So, but why can bumblebees actually fly? Now, this was happening. This dinner party was in the 1930s when aerodynamic science was in its infancy. And this guy was doing calculations with the assumption that bumblebee wings were kind of like airplane wings. But that's just not true. Airplane wings are smooth and flat, and they don't move. But bumblebee wings have lots of bumps and zigs and zags, and they're constantly flapping. And it's this constant flapping that creates the airfoil that gives the bumblebee enough lift to stay aloft. So we can remind our students that every time they see a bumblebee, let it remind them that if anybody tells them that they're not going to be able to do something that they set their mind to, tell them, check your assumptions. I am a University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Panther, and I can do whatever I set my mind to, and then drop the mic, walk away, and leave them in your black and gold dust. And so at that, I will stop the share. Oh, yes, and I'm wearing Panther colors. Yes, so I will stop the share and turn it back over to my host. And I see I'm getting some applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. I've so enjoyed it, and have a great rest of the conference.